Okay, hi there. Now that I know that we're really online, I'm going to start again. And thank you all for hopping over to this new video that we actually created that's really live streaming to you now. So thank you all for joining. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but now we're all here and going. So yes, my name is Sid Steidy. I'm director of Small Press Traffic. We are based in the Bay Area on the unceded land of the Ohlone people. To learn more about our organization and our land acknowledgement and to see links to the Indigenous communities in our area, you can visit our website at smallpresstraffic.org. I'm so excited to be presenting this event in collaboration with Kenning Editions. I worked with Patrick Durgan and Zoe Tuck on this presentation, and I'm just really looking forward to seeing what evolves from each person and what they'll contribute. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to pass things over to Zoe, who's going to host and provide context for the event. And yeah, thanks again.
All right. Hi. Thanks for that, Sid. Yeah, my name is Zoe Tuck, and I sort of entered into this project helping Patrick Durgan at Kenning to promote this fabulous new translation, Festivals of Patience, the verse poems of Arthur Rimbaud, translated by Brian Kim Stefans. And I'm mainly here, like the rest of the audience members, as just a curious reader and student of translation. And, I think one of the things that's exciting about a new translation of a canonical figure is that, it's a way to reintroduce people to someone whose impression might have become a little dusty, a little fusty, a little ossified, and we've maybe lost touch with the vitality of a writer. So this is a very important process of renewal. And tonight is designed. I mean, the title is Our Rimbaud. So it's sort of what is the state of the poet, and how are people making use of his work and his legacy, and also, tweaking it, deterning it. So yeah, I'm just here to say that, and to say, obviously, if you haven't seen the book yet, you should buy the book. I think there's going to be a link to it in the chat. And the bios, I think, will also be available at the link. In trying to keep things tight tonight, I'm just going to read. We asked for basically like 1 to 2 sentences for each reader's project. So I'll just read those, and then I'll be passing it off to Jennifer Moxley, who wrote a beautiful introduction to the book. Again. Yeah, so, and then Jennifer will pass to Brian, who will start us off reading some of the translations. And then we'll be having Mathilda Cullen, who, I guess I'll just read them now. Mathilda Cullen, who considers Rimbaud as an acid communist. Stephen Ira, who discusses what Rimbaud's work can mean for queer and trans writers in a time when the queer and trans writer isn't necessarily an outsider. I also think this is the first of 2 readings he's doing tonight, which is, my hat is off if I had a hat. Aristile Kirby reads from the soul steeping in Rimbaud's verse, but in a new poetic form that will be unveiled today, the Vajra Macrogram. And Anna Vitale ponders the late-20th century version of Rimbaud, An Unsurvivable Life, in New York East Village scene artist David Wojnarowicz's work. And then it's back to Brian Kim Stefans for a few more of the translations, and then you'll see me again. At that point, you may just leave, but I'll wave goodbye, and the evening will be officially ended. So I will be quiet and pass it over to Jennifer Moxley.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Sid. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this event. I love this book. I'll hold mine up too. I love Festivals of Patience, and I'm thrilled that it has given us an occasion to discuss and celebrate our Rimbaud. And I'm thrilled to hear what our participants have to share. I wrote in my foreword to the book that, quote, a visionary translation of a great poet from the past records a sympathy between a living writer and a dead one, unquote. It is a kind of love that results in a completely new body of work written by a never before heard of poet, a poet who vagabonded from the Ardennes to Paris in the 1870s in order to launch an offensive on French literature, all the while writing searing synesthetic poems on a typewriter in Los Angeles in dodecasyllabic American English. That you might hear what I'm talking about, I'll quote what Stefans tells us was Rimbaud's last poem, a portrait of soldiers crammed together in a barracks, eating day-old bread and dreaming of cheese, Gruyere, Roquefort, Brie. C'est la vie, they cry, which Stefans renders perfectly as fuck this shit. This hybrid of Rimbaud and Stefans has long been in the works. When just a lad studying under John Ashbery at Bard College, Stefans translated Rimbaud's excrescent paean to a brat bard in the making, the poet at 7 years. A brief excerpt from that poem in the new volume testifies to how Stefans' method of close hearing, ghosting Rimbaud's metrical patterns, gesturing toward his end rhyme, creates a compelling poetic line. I'll read a little segment from the version of the poet at 7 years that is in Festivals of Patience. Quote, supremely intelligent for that long dry day, he sweated obedience. Yet some darker strains spasmed his cheek, advertising his hypocrisy. In dimly lit halls decked with mildewed drapery, his 2 fists in his groin, his tongue stiff as a dart, he'd squeeze his eyelids shut, airborne among the spots. While respectful of the various beatnik and rock star Rimbauds previous translators and critics have constructed, including Wallace Fally, honored through Stefans' title, Festivals of Patience, which he tells us in his introduction comes from a Fally translation of Rimbaud that he read, that Stefans read as a boy. Stefans' framing rescues Rimbaud from the niche of the countercultural anti-brand and returns him to his role as cosmic citizen, an Orphic poet who disorders the senses in order to civilize with number and harmony a disordered society, a poet who journeys to the underworld to give us a vision of the future that may allow us to find eternity once more. It was such a great pleasure to read this text and to write a foreword for this translation by Brian Kim Stefans of Rimbaud. And it is an even greater pleasure to introduce Brian today, who will read from the book.
Hi all, and sorry for all the technical stuff, but I'm sure everyone's acquainted with these kinds of issues. Yeah, I really have to thank Zoe and Sid for organizing this event. I think it's a perfect way to, for me to kind of get out the news about the book without having like a boring just reading. And also obviously thank Patrick, who is enthusiastic about this project from the beginning. And thank you, Jennifer, again, for doing even more writing about this book. And her introduction is kind of put my introduction to shame. So it was really lovely. So I just, I thought some of the comments or some of the quotes that came up in Zoe's introduction were, kind of point to why I decided to go back to Rimbaud. Yeah, I did start reading him in high school with the Fally translations, and I realized I understood his relationship to punk and relationship to the beats and so forth, but not really not knowing French at all. Really, my Rimbaud would be filtered through all these American sources, but also but as an aspiring poet and maybe a foolishly ambitious poet, I was quite impressed. So I'd see the translation on the right, which would just be in free verse or some kind of very literal verse, and then on the left you'd see these formally perfect poems. They were all rhyming quatrains, a lot of them. And I think the image of Rimbaud at the time was that he was so impatient with poetry that he was essentially a free verse poet, but was forced to write in forms. But my sense is that no, that's probably not the case. He probably enjoyed it on a certain level. You have to enjoy writing form, writing, that way if you're going to write a good poem, basically. But some of the things that were said in Zoe's, acid communist, I think that's what I heard. That's a Rimbaud that is always going to be interesting. His relationship to queer and trans writers, I think, that's another interesting thing, another strand. And then there was the line soul steeping. And, Rimbaud's soul is probably, that's another thing that you could talk about. And then unsurvivable life is another phrase. So, Rimbaud is just, and then as Jennifer said, offensive on French literature. And clearly what eventually happened, even though he wouldn't have been able to anticipate it, was an offensive on all of literature. So, for a young kid in like Jersey City, this is all like really cool. So I just want to read a couple of paragraphs from the letter of the seer, which is in the back of this. And again, because I think it just points to how extraordinary and extreme his own life mission as a poet was. And I think just as a last note, in our time when a lot of, let's say, subversive, transformative, aesthetic projects, can be described kind of abstractly and always in a sense of like we're doing something productive. Rimbaud kind of, he never really said that he was doing anything productive for society. He was always against a lot of stuff, but in an exciting way. So I always come back to Rimbaud even when I'm teaching, because I think it just shows a poet who never wrote about his own work, but he did write about his own kind of personal mission, which was always like kind of bodily and then also obviously literary. So he says in this book, which everyone's holding up, which is nice because the cover is really beautiful. The first study of the man who wants to be a poet is the knowledge of himself complete. He seeks his soul, inspects it, tests it, learns it. As soon as he knows it, he must cultivate it. It seems simple. In every mind, a natural development takes place. So many egoists proclaim themselves authors. There are many others who attribute to themselves their intellectual progress. So he's, this is a weird idea. It's like people attribute to themselves their own intellectual progress. And he's saying, that's wrong, but the soul must be made monstrous in the manner of the Comperchicos, if you will. Imagine a man implanting and cultivating warts on his face. So, when I read that in high school, I was like, what a weird aesthetic project. You have to make yourself, the Comperchicos he picked up from a Balzac novel, it was a Hugo novel, and it's kind of racist, actually. Hugo had created this kind of type of person in Mexico who would mutilate children and then display them as freaks in shows and stuff like that. So there was never such thing as a Comperchicos, but that's where he gets it. And then the next line is, I say one must be a seer, make oneself a seer, or un voyant. The poet makes himself a seer, and this is one of the most famous sentences, by a long, gigantic, and rational disordering of all the senses, all forms of love, suffering, madness. He searches himself, he exhausts all poisons in himself, keeps only their quintessences. Unspeakable torture, where he needs all his faith, all of his superhuman strength, where he becomes before all the great patient, the great criminal, the one accursed, and the supreme scholar. So, this mix of like, you're a scholar, but you're a criminal, because he reaches the unknown. Since he cultivated his soul rich already, more than anyone, he reaches the unknown, and when, alarmed, he ends up by losing the intelligence of his visions. He has seen them. So he's saying, he's seen them, but he also loses the ability to even do anything with them. Let him die in his career for unprecedented and unnameable things. Other horrible workers will come. And he uses the word workers quite a bit. He did think about labor quite a bit. They will start from the horizons where the other collapsed. So that's just a few paragraphs from that very famous letter. And I just want to read two sonnets from this book that I think offer the two different sides of Rimbaud. I mean, one is one of his most famous sonnets, Vowels, which is probably his most mystical statement, which a lot of people have written about, where he gives colors to the vowels, and this would be very synesthetic. So let me just read that one. Vowel, A black, E white, I red, U green, O blue. Vowels. Someday I will betray your burgeoning nascence. A hairy corset of black glittering flies, gambling around the void of a punishing stench, gulfs of shadows. E, white of steam clouds, bivouac tents, the pikes of proud glaciers, white kings or Queen Anne's lace. I, purples, blood from split lips, laughing with vengeance, or saturnine remorse, rouging a doll-like face. You, circuits, changing tides on divine green-flecked seas, peace of dull animals on fertile pastures, peace of a pensive, curled brow, engrossed by alchemy. O supreme trumpet, strange with solar key changes, silences only spanned by worlds and by angels. O the Omega, the violet beam from his eyes. So because I decided to translate it into essentially English Alexandrians, I often have to add or change a phrase. So one thing that I, just as a note, I have this phrase, strange with solar key changes. So a key change is like what you hear in music. And the idea that this solar system would change the key was kind of my own insertion, but if you read the original line, it is all about sound and strangeness and so forth. So that's just an example if anyone's curious about translation. And then the second one I want to read, I mean, there are many poems like his famous sonnet to the asshole, which are very physical and but also just full of images. And this one is literally a poem, and this is like one of the poems I really didn't know when I was in high school, but when I translated it, it got me to like really obviously learn his poem. So this one's called Evening Prayer, and it's really just about drinking and taking a pee. But if you listen to the imagery, it's really quite wonderful. Evening Prayer. Seated I thrive, cherubic, as if in the grip of a barber, fist curled around a fluted mug. My neck and hypogastrium arched, Gambier pipe in my jaw, the air thick with impalpable smoke. Like the fresh droppings in a rickety birdhouse, 1,000 dreams coddle me, warm with their promise. Often the spirit courses like virgin sapwood, bloodied by the young, cloudy gold of its seepage. Then, when I have imbibed impeccably my dreams, having downed 30 or 40 mugs, I come to and collect myself to relieve the bitter need. Courtly, a high lord of the cedar and hyssop, I piss towards somber skies, very lofty, far off, that sun horror bloom approving the heliotrope. So that's about it. Now, I'm sorry, but I actually forget who I introduced next. Could someone pipe in and just tell me who goes next so I know?
I believe we're on to Mathilda next, and then after Mathilda, Stephen.
Okay, so thank you very much, and I'll see you later.
All right, hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I am going to talk today about Rimbaud as an acid communist, like Brian said, and I'm very glad that he started off with the one of the letters that I'm focusing on. So I'm going to be reading from what was my undergrad thesis, which I called The Horizon is a Kettle. And I wanted to start off by talking about how when the communards took Paris in 1871, they smashed every clock in the city. And so now I'll start my talk. So this is from a chapter called An Absolute Redistribution of All the Senses, or Rimbaud as an Acid Communist. Rimbaud's been named by figures like Bertolt Brecht and Frederick Jameson to be the first poet to articulate the trajectory of global capital. Brecht himself said in conversation with Benjamin that Marx and Engels, had they read The Drunken Boat, would have sensed in it the great historical movement of which it is the expression. They would have clearly recognized that what it describes is not an eccentric poet going for a walk, but the flight, the escape of a man who cannot bear to live any longer inside the barriers of a class which was then beginning to open up even the more exotic continents to its mercantile interests. And so I wanted to talk about Rimbaud and acid communism. Specifically, my like thesis kind of had to do with Mark Fisher and Sean Bonney, so you'll hear a little bit of them in here, but also Kristen Ross, who has written about Rimbaud in The Emergence of Social Space, and how she kind of notes how The Drunken Boat is goes on this movement from, this river, or how I believe, I don't know if I have the poem with me in Brian's translation, but I believe Beckett translates it as passive rivers, and then like bursts out into this unrestrained kind of ocean. And so while it's doing this dual movement of bursting out into like unrestrained space, it's also connecting this river to global capital. And so I really want to talk about Rimbaud's, what Brian just said of the complete, total rational derangement of all the senses in relation to acid communism, which was Mark Fisher's last manuscript, which was unfinished at the end of K-Punk. And so throughout Fisher's work, he kind of opposes acid communism and capitalist realism, whereas, you want to read acid communism being the kind of antidote to capitalist realism, even though they both look very similar. And so Kristen Ross in her book kind of looks at the ordered disorganization of capital and Rimbaud's long, boundless, reasoned disordering of the senses, or like the anarchic chaos of the Rimbaudиan subject and the anarchic chaos of high capital. And so something that Fisher says is that if something like ADHD is a pathology, it is the pathology of late capital. And so I got really interested both in reading Bonney, reading Rimbaud, and listening to like hyperpop as to the question of whether what value there is in creating work which emulates the pathology in question. So, specifically with work that like embodies the frenetic kind of very fast and like sensual bombardment of capital. And I was asking whether this demonstrates and just kind of reifies the psychic domain of capital, or if it allows for a conceptual escape hatch. And so in my paper, I talk a bit about 100 gex, but I'll try to ignore that, even though I think it's very fun. What was I going to say? So yeah, in Rimbaud's letters, what I'm most interested about is exactly what Brian read earlier with making oneself a seer, his voyant poetics. And so yeah, I wanted to what is it? His derangement of all the senses, or what Brian writes as the disordering of all the senses. There's this bit which is I'm opening up to it in Brian's translation. He reaches the unknown, and when alarmed, he ends up by losing the intelligence of his visions. He has seen them. Let him die in his career through unprecedented and unnameable things. Other horrible workers will come. They will start from the horizons where the other collapsed. and so I was really interested in this kind of like cosmic notion where, you know, you have one seer, one kind of this the one Rimbauden subject that is kind of making these like strides of horizon to horizon via this derangement of the senses. And I'm actually glad that Brian read the vowel poem, because that very much influenced Bonnie. But the kind of way that the disordering of all the senses. I mean, there's also a quote in Marx that I can't remember entirely, where like he's talking about how the way that the five senses are that they're conceived and kind of prescribed under capital is like a limitation, and that there is a way beyond it. And so kind of I was really taken with the way that the Rimbauden project of sensorial derangement is this larger historical process of, you know, fucking with the senses that goes beyond one individual psyche, you know. And that's what he means when he's like, let him die as he leaps through these horizons. Other horrible workers will come. And like I mentioned earlier at the start, the kind of proximity of Rimbaud to the Paris Commune is something that I was really interested in, because he writes a couple poems about it, but Kristen Ross really delves into this, and specifically in the emergence of the transformation of social space in Paris, where she writes that street fighting does not take place on the street, but in the houses, not in the open, but under cover. It depends on mobility or permanent displacement. It depends on changing houses into passageways, reversing or suspending the division between public and private space. The interior becomes a street. And so the communard's suspension of vertical space and its like immediate horizontal redistribution, where the walls are demolished to make footpaths for soldiers, has kind of this, it's this really, I find it as like a really good metaphor for this kind of like the reconfiguration of spatio temporal history that you see in Bonnie, that, you know, you see in like hyperpop remixes that like bring out that in samples that bring out, you know, shit from the like 20s and 40s. But I was really interested in the way that like the bridging of revolutionary time works toward this destruction of bourgeois subjectivity in the production of this Rimbauden subject, or the seer. So the long systematic disordering of all the senses, or the French, which is déranger, I parsed it in reading it as an absolute redistribution, which, you know, you can see in that one poem where he's assigning you know, colors to the letters. Like that's, as you know, even if it's kind of like a rudimentary synesthesia, it's kind of, you know, it's getting at something. And you know, it's one way that he tries to like lay the foundation for new forms of perception and potential consciousness outside of capital psychic domain, and new confluences of the senses. Yeah, and so there's something that Marcuse says of Mallarmé's poetry, which is that it conjures up new modes of perception, imagination, gestures, a feast of sensuousness which shatters everyday experience and anticipates a different reality principle. And so this kind of just, my talk is a little just frazzled, but I'm really interested in the way that verse and poetry in the Rimbauden vein, or like, you know, after Sean Bonney, or even hyperpop in the way that it's kind of like really frenetic and really like stimulating, is like a strategy to reorient ourselves within capital and morph the senses so we can like perceive what is beyond the official horizon. And so this is kind of what I was thinking about with Rimbaud in relation to acid communism And thank you.
Okay, good.
Hi, I thought that was my cue. I'm not muted, right? No, I'm not muted. Okay. Hi, I'm Stephen Ira, and I'm going to share some sort of provocations about the poet Maudit in our present moment that are part of sort of a larger project I'm working on that has to do with queer generationality, kind of like broadly speaking. What is the poet Maudit in the age of queer assimilation? I pose the question this way because once it is no longer part of common sense that homosexuality is wrong, the category has already become a puzzling one. Its coherence relies upon the unspeakability and therefore the biographical obviousness of the poet's antisocial behavior. Hence, when the poet Paul Verlaine formally inducted his ex-lover into this category by including him in the titular anthology, his own byline was curse enough to curse Rimbaud. Indeed, to be cursed is to be absent, to be thrown out of the bar for one's behavior, or never to become known in the first place to particular others, or only to be known through negation. Had we consulted Rimbaud, writes Verlaine, whose address we don't know, he would have, it is probable, counseled us against undertaking the project which presently concerns us. Here is the original doubling of Rimbaud with his audience, that vague swarm, we, as Anna Vitale writes in her essay on David Wojnarowicz and Rimbaud. Whoever feel addressed by him are like him, and he is the source of our identification, a root for our identity. And already Verlaine, a canny procurer, knows to make us like Rimbaud by proffering the titillating idea that Rimbaud, like Anne Rice, might disapprove of his own fandom and its activities. This is Verlaine's version of the famous insight about those other horrible workers. Such help is sometimes best sought by trying to avoid it. Verlaine's, for my purposes, is of more use, since it is contingent on the same myth that propelled James Dean, Marlon Brando, and others in the wave of actors influenced by the relational realism of the group theater, that the artistic encounter should feel as though the artist would almost rather not be there, like grumpy method actors. Of course, this is not how it feels quite to read Rimbaud, but in writing eulogizing his career and his literal person by his loved ones, written within his lifetime but not during his poetic career, we are sold a bill of goods based on his inaccessibility to the madding crowd and his disinterest in fame. Today, Verlaine writes, things separate us from him, without, of course, his genius and his character ever having lacked our deep admiration. This kind of rebel hero is a place to put both absence and sincerity. In this way, he fulfills some of the roles of Lee Edelman's child, since he exists to receive and to portend a future for the avant-garde. It is his opinion we are thinking of when we wonder, feeling paranoid, wondering in Eve Sedgwick's terms, whether something is kind of hegemonic or kind of subversive, whether we should be seen, not only by others, but by ourselves, to be fond of it. That even here, I confuse the political with the aesthetic is par for the course, since our rebel hero's aesthetic and political life is symbolically cut off at his exit from poetry, as we all know, just as he has been fully begun to articulate his view of the relation between the two. This persistent confusion is one of the places where a world starved for jouissance begins to manage that access through the adolescent's plasticity, rather than the negativity Edelman claims is so queer. And I'm indebted here, I should say, to Jules Gill-Peterson and her book, The Transgender Child, The Histories of the Transgender Child, where she talks about plasticity and the plasticity of the child, and particularly the transgender child. David Wojnarowicz made images of murderous and murdered teens. He fantasized himself both as a teen and as a father in different pieces, and both are murderous. See also, obviously, Dennis Cooper. In the story of the celebrity bad boy, the lost rebel angel, fame is figured as a way of rescuing generationality from the critique of the family. In recognizing the eternally plastic nature of the adolescent body, we are delivered into identification with an ostensibly de-Oedipalized father, as plastic as we have learned we are, because he is a void who never reproduced, except when he was, as Verlaine signed himself, your old cunt. As much of a relief as Munoz's pull toward the future once offered us, the opportunity to ask about the actual contours of our imaginations, we still recognize the danger of the child and of a revolution defined by its own absence. Rimbaud, the story of Rimbaud, the figure behind the mask in David Wojnarowicz's pictures, allows us to resolve the contradiction between contrarianism and complacency, as we attempt to imagine not a future, but a present for the poet moderne of 2021. Generationality allows us to talk about the loss of a world, and particularly the perverse and narcissistic generationality allowed by Rimbaud allows us to talk about the loss of worlds built by and for people abused by reproductive futurism, and particularly by the lies it tells to artists about gentrification, assimilation, and urban development. Lies about neighborhoods, developers, and universities. Lies about liberalism and incremental progress. Lies about the respect that age is entitled to, or youth. The Muse. Oh well, long live our fathers, wrote Verlaine, parenthetically. The Muse, let us say, of Monsieur Arthur Rimbaud. Anna Vitale writes, David Wojnarowicz's photographs set in motion a narrowing of the wide scope of time and difference, urging us to identify with the collapse of difference. The psychoanalyst and writer Adam Phillips would ask, what might this kind of identification be a solution for? Understanding oneself in relation to another through a special and externally determined connection, like the coincidence of dates, helps close a gap that is otherwise stretched by distance and lack. The bottoming father? Only as this father can we dream of ourselves, like David Thewlis, dreaming of DiCaprio's Rimbaud in the final scene of the celebrity biopic, Total Eclipse. It's also Professor Lupin. The fact that he's also Professor Lupin is, for me, very important to that. I apologize for mentioning that. But this lost rebel youth is an extremely unstable marker, as through him our future becomes not about what we might do, but what our fathers might have done, if we had ever had a chance to know them, if they had not died, if they had not ceased to write poetry. In this way, we claim a lineage while still rescuing our queer elders from ever having to grow up. Instead of fully embodying Lee Edelman's desire that we disinvest in the future, we have simply installed the adolescent's disdain for childhood. If, as Vitale says, Wojnarowicz's Rimbaud gazes simultaneously at future and past, the infinite and the condensed, where does he stand? The answer, as usual, is nowhere. Even in Catherine Bond Stockton's ostensibly seminal The Queer Child, this child is a ghost, a spectral creature, unable to appear except in the memory of an adult. Few flesh and blood children are mentioned in her book, and the first is a murder victim who comes pre-dead. Perhaps us kids who grew up as queer youths, listening to queer theory's great debate over reproductive futurism, succeeded at least a little in a disinvestment from the child. We have ended up, by some confusion, unable to arrive not in the future, but in the present. After all, as we are told, most of the resources inside the gay child are needed elsewhere, outside of her life, as grist for the mill of signification. There is no present for anyone whose past included actually appearing as a flesh and blood gay child or queer youth. Vitale writes, the body of so-called Rimbaud confronts us with what we were not able to prevent. Look at what I did, the body says. Look at what you didn't see coming. There are two major imagined disaster points for mismanaged adolescent queer plasticity right now. There's detransition, or neoliberalization. Having failed in the queer child's care, we have allowed him to become the dupe of the patriarchy. He's now going to ruin his body. We're going to need to rescue him from that. And that might result in the other sort of major disaster point, which is, of course, suicide. And when we think about the suicides of queer young people, if you think about that sort of moment in like 2012, where it was like, everyone has to wear purple to like honor queer young people who might kill themselves. In a lot of these narratives, like bullying was always sort of foregrounded as the thing that was causing these deaths. Even though in a lot of the stories, there was an absence of actual sort of narratives of people being bullied. And no one ever seemed to bring up, and this is an insight that the writer and performer Dan Fishback offered to me, that simply homophobia might hurt. And that even in the absence of sort of being tortured by like some sort of villainous bully figure, you might just be in pain because of it. In my community, we have a literary tradition of comparing poets to transsexuals, and now I am going to do it. Rimbaud is like a transsexual man in that so many mentions of him are attended by the mention of his absence. Isn't it funny how no one talks about trans men? Not with the tone of a eulogy, though. It is somewhere between the tone of a eulogy and the tone of a hunting guide. Rimbaud is like a transsexual man in that he refuses to stop looking adolescent, even after pictures come out in which his lifestyle has clearly and noticeably aged him. Rimbaud is like a transsexual man in that the indeterminacy and plasticity of his adolescence has become central to the problems of modernist and late modernist accounts of consciousness, particularly when these accounts address themselves, at least in part, to repressive social norms. Graham Robb, one of the principal architects of the contemporary Rimbaud myth, understands the slicing, the dicing, the knife skills of a good biographer. And the story he tells shows us Rimbaud's mother, abandoned by a soldier husband who at first was deployed elsewhere and later disappeared so completely that his wife referred to herself as the widow Rimbaud and no one questioned it, although her husband was alive. In this self-authored adulthood, Robb paints a picture, this self-authored widowhood, whoa, interesting. Robb paints a picture of a religiously orthodox and aesthetically immovable woman, deeply concerned with the correct replication of the social form. We might joke that here Robb comes a little too close to Bruno Bettelheim and other mistaken theorists of autism in accidentally implying that refrigerator mothers cause modernism, or autism, whichever it is. Gay children in the corner, stimming, pushing on our own eyes. Rimbaud found his famous exit from his mother's world, and we all know how. But what about his sister Isabel, to whom he wrote so many lost letters of advice during his shameful life as a profiteer on colonialism? Isabel, who reauthored his life in terms of respectability, claiming his deathbed conversion to Christianity. I'm seeing Brian ask in the chat about refrigerator mothers. Refrigerator mothers is like a sort of old theory of autism and how it might come about, where basically psychologists in the mid-century sort of said, oh, well, maybe these are just bad mothers. They're not affectionate enough. They're refrigerator mothers. They're chilly, they're cold. And maybe that's why kids end up being autistic. So just, sorry, okay. What about his sister, Isabel, to whom he wrote so many lost letters of advice during his shameful life as a profiteer on colonialism? She accomplished this exit through a marriage to her brother's biographer. And it's too tempting here to suggest that Isabel traded access to an authentic version of her brother's myth for the relative economic freedom and agency that this marriage could offer her. She became an ordinary critic, an ordinary poet. I have never read her writing because I don't speak French and it hasn't been translated. Oh, Rimbaud, let us survive to do this, to be gay, to be ordinary poets and critics, and please, prevent it. Let us stay inside our father's cunt. And then to tie things off, I'm just gonna read one of my own poems, which is called Why Do I Only Want Grammatical? And I just want to say thank you so much for including me in this event. This is so exciting. I really am inspired by the other writers who are here. And it's just such a thrill. So thank you so much. And thanks to Max Crandall for kind of connecting me to this and for being my Verlaine, of course. A much nicer Verlaine. Why do I only want grammatical? Why do I only want grammatical coherence? Why is that my only note? I want grammatical and philosophical coherence as I see it. I resent cis anyone in the position of incoherence, like a womb, a waiting room. Why shouldn't they have it? Just because other white people praise me for this pose and punish me if I do not adopt it, doesn't mean no one should have any fun or need tell me a story instead of a forest, the pathless forest after which you get married, where I do in fact live, but am not permitted to visit. Thank you so much. I apologize if that sounded a little bit like the ramblings of someone who's trying to figure out who the Zodiac killer is. And I think I'm now to introduce Aristilde Kirby. So yay, I'm excited to hear what Aris has to share with us.
You should unmute yourself, Eris.
Ha! Duh. My apologies. Hi, everyone. Hi, YouTubers. My name is Aristilde Kirby. You can just call me Aristo. It's like Paris without the P. I'm a poet. Although these days I think of myself more as like an artist whose prima materia works with language. Yeah, so I'm here to introduce to you a form that I made, if you haven't heard of it or read it before, called the Vajra Macrogram. I consider myself a Buddhist, or at least I have come to that very recently as a sort of practice. And when I was in grad school, I was trying to, I think I found myself like, I need to make something new for me, like my own personal form. And it actually started, the Vajra Macrogram started as a thing called the Envoyelle. And it was just like 17 line syllables for like 17 lines, and I needed to make it more interesting. So at a really specific time, the Buddhism thing came about, and I was like, oh, cool. Well, what does Vajra mean? And I was looking for like a sacred sort of weapon. And the Vajra word means, lightning, thunderbolt and diamond at the same time. So it's like diamond / thunderbolt. And the macrogram comes from a sort of poetic form that Anton Berrigan turned me on to called what's it called? Oh yeah, the microgram by Jorge Correa Andrade. And that sort of like small book that Wave Books put out kind of a while ago is kind of like this culmination, this accumulation of small verse poetry forms found over time. And by him basically, and he was basically explicating on, what unites these sort of international small forms of poetry together, like the song or the haiku, for example. And I was very much, even before this point, reading a lot of haiku, especially a book called On Haiku by Hikaru Sato, which is amazing. If you've never heard of it, or if you've never read it, please go read it. It's a really good version of, like, it's just like a really good, super really comprehensive rundown of how the haiku has changed throughout time, and how it's never been a sort of static verse form, and from its origins to where it leapt out to. So, I think of the haiku as a sort of like a weird queer form, and when I think about Rimbaud and dereglementation, a sort of disordering, I think of that was kind of like a key sort of impulse or principle for making my own form. So yeah, and so with that dereglementation and that sort of fasciation, it's sort of like all of my short poems aren't 575, and so I decided to sort of constellate them. They all have numbers. And I'm gonna read it to you, and I think of it almost as like a sort of mixtape. Personal mixtape from me to you, to the reader. And yeah, I guess I'll read mine. And there's like 3 different ways you could read it, but I guess I'll read it to you 2 ways. And one is called the Crash Blossom way, and the other one is called the haiku-esque sort of way. So the larger poem overall is called Nuit Tamon / Evening Album 2. Evening Album 1 you'll probably never see because I wrote it for someone. But this is like a good sort of continuity of it. And Nuit Tamon is a French word meaning nightly. And this whole poem is after Arthur Rimbaud and Brian Kim Stefans, who I picked the language from and sort of adapted in my own way, because I love language at the end of the day. And Barbara Guest, who is one of the lesser known sort of New York school poets who were sort of veering towards language, more so towards the end of her I guess career or whatever. But yeah, her book Defensive Rapture is one of my favorite books. I remember Cedar Saigo was talking about it as just like Barbara's just like trying to take language and barricade it against a door, in this sort of way. And I didn't necessarily see it as that, but coming off of Defensive Rapture, I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But her poems are really nocturnal and really luscious. So let's get to it, shall we? Ready? So this first one, as a part of the evening album, is called Verdigris. Splayed apricot tellen. Word digress verdigris. You kiss like seafoam green. Number 1, Widow's Moonstone, E, like as with a woman. And another thing that I did for this poem was, so a lot of the maybe like proximal titles like Widow's Moonstone, E refers to, I guess, the voyelle, the Rimbaud sort of like use of color in that poem specifically. So yeah, 1, Widow's Moonstone, E, or like as if with a woman, which is a line from a Rimbaud poem. Twilight reclines on the chase. A flash rests in satellite locket, sterling, flesh cushioned. 5, Guilty Nectarine, Y. Gammon gazelle ground tresses, commired by sweet desircere, barely blush past your notice. 13, Shed. Now the clouds are slight with lymph, and scale print rip as if a coral snake slid through sky sand. 15, Jujubly. My Prosecco-lalia, confetti our dates lack. I peel jujubes to corkscrews. 8, Nachtigalls. And this is after one of my friends who I met recently. Her name is Jenny Nachtigall, and I just thought Nachtigall was such a cool name because it has night in it in German, I think. But anyway, shout out to Jenny. 8, Nachtigalls. Coin frog warbles cuddle the wold like a wilting lung to its overgrowth. 4, Plitvice / quicksand, A. And it's also, the subtitle is Mimicrying 3. En crescence lobe a warm room, as room plits into the sheets like chia seed into silt. 6, Eclosions and temporal distortions. Tan cicada mask molted, still maracaras distort dim walls damesque slip. 10, Volta, or Mimicrying 4. Alarm Amrita pages, Amrita pages, shower frosted glass, and cease with a turn. 11, Rest, or I hate my fucking life right now. And this is after the chanteuse and actress Charlotte Gainsbourg from her album Rest. Want to rest in my blanket because I'm tired of thinking of this goddamn mess. 14, Agnyastra, O, or Kurukul's reprise. And Kurukul is like this Buddhist sort of deity. She was a charnel ground fairy, but she has like a floral bow, very floral accoutrement. So yeah, 14. And Agnyastra is a Sanskrit word that means fire arrow. Gladiolas vibrate like viola gut wound, goat gut wound in cobalt astral braid in tone. 7, Asphodelyria. Inui, sleeping lapine. Eupnea, led as hop. Ramoon's fever with heat. 12, Ulterior votive. A shade formed acrylicorn horn, spice basted by secreted luteolin form. And where are we? Oh, 3, Jejunely. June's unable uncrossed legs, abets key fret dishabille of her silhouette espadrilles. Where are we? Let's do 2. Bijou, Bijou, Betalis 2, or I. Night mouth nicked as dog's door knock. Blood cabochon spread like jam on lips hem brioche as tart. And this is basically the full thing, Crash Blossom style, as I mentioned earlier. Twilight reclines on the chase. Night mouth nicked as dog's door knock. June's unable uncrossed legs. A flash rest in satellite blood cabochon spread like jam. Abetting key fret dishabille locket. Sterling, flesh cushioned, on lip hems brioche's tart of her silhouette espadrilles. En Crisson's lobe a warm room, gammon gazelle ground tresses, tan cicada mask molted, as room plits the sheets commired by sweet desirsier. Still maracadas like chia seed into silt, barely blush past you noticed, distort dim walls damask slip. Inui, sleeping lapine, coin frog warbles cuddle splayed apricot tillen. Eutnia let us hop, the wold like a wilting word digress verdigris, remoons fever with heat, lung to its overgrowth. You kiss like seafoam green. Alarm Amrita pages. Want to rest in my blanket. A shade form acrylic horn showers frosted glass because I'm tired of horn spice basted by end, cease, with a turn, wing steam. Thinking of this goddamn mess, secreted luteolin form. Now the clouds are slight with lymph. Legiolias vibrate like my proseculalia, and scale print rip as if a viola goat gut wound in confetti, our dates lack. Coral snakes slid through sky sand, cobalt astral braid and tone. I peel jujubes to corkscrews. It's true, I cry too much. 4 in the morn, it smells like pure spit outside. I can feel the cruor in my chest like a blackberry lumping as I make out solar pennant flags on the horizon and hear a yellow bunting. Meanwhile, I fucking guess I'm supposed to do something amazing with this flung farthing you gave me. Fine. With a quaver in my voice then, I'll eclipse the sun in hopes the night never spends. Yet, it is. Why do I feel the unding, undone, and flooding, figuring you're not coming? And I do believe that that's that. But wait, I have a bonus track because usually with the Vajra is what I do is I make an excess. Oh, hey, thanks, Brian. Usually I make an excess. So it's like three sort of haiku-esque fragments to a sort of stanza, quote unquote. And what happens is that I usually make like 5 or 6, and I just sort of like shuffle them together and I sort of piece them together. And the poem you hear is like sort of the final version of it that comes that's come to my head. So there are a lot of like bonus sort of songs on the cutting room floor. And this is one because this poem went through a lot of history. And it used to be called Nenufarius / Evening Album 2. And Nenufar is the water lily. And I'm so glad that Brian translated that as Nenufar, as like, didn't even like translate it, just like brought it over like Nenufar. Like that's such a beautiful word for water lily. And I wish it was named Nenufar and not water lily, but whatever. But yeah, it's called, I'm gonna read you just like a bonus little small one called Nenufarius, which is like a sort of neologization of Nenufar and Nefarious. And this one, and you is missing from the evening album. So this is Nenufarius you, which is green, I believe, in the voyelles of Rimbaud. Funereal leaf rune spry sprite, Nenufarius, surfs on pyrowisp sword on air. It's lit. And thank you, everyone. Shout out to Stephen for the intro. Thank you for everyone. Thank you for everyone for coming. Shout out to Sawako Nakiyasu. You're one of my favorite poets alive. So thank you for being here. Shout out to Zoe, shout out to Brian, shout out to Sid, shout out to Anna, shout out to Mathilda, shout out to everyone, shout out to Jennifer. Daisy and Catherine too. My new chapbook is coming out next month, or Daisy and Catherine Squared. Yeah. If you don't, yeah. Thanks everyone. And fuck the haters. Ciao. Oh, and next is my good friend Anna Vitale.
Thanks, Eris, and all that came before, and those who will follow. This is a translation of our Rimbaud Masque, which is a chapbook that is a chapter from my dissertation, a pamphlet that Ugly Duckling published a couple years ago. This is the back, and this is the, the front. And this is a translation of a loose translation, written yesterday after breakfast at 7 months pregnant. I thought I could start by translating a sentence I've already written. Here's the sentence in need. The dream of survival that constitutes the fantasy comes to be expressed in Wojnarowicz's series Through the Mask. Here's the translation. The mask that David Wojnarowicz makes in the late 70s of Arthur Rimbaud's face is a dream of survival. So the mask of Rimbaud is a dream, and what's it a dream of? How come we need such dreams? Many folks are living with the intergenerational trauma of the unsurvivability of their lives. And one way to survive is to find and or create a witness. Today, I like to imagine an extremely nerdy joke. Wojnarowicz says to Rimbaud, "Can I get a witness?" And Rimbaud says, "Witness," and hands Wojnarowicz a mask of Wojnarowicz's face, which is something another artist, Emily Royston, has made, riffing on this act of seeing oneself from outside oneself as another. And this lineage of artists representing acts of witnessing is a fragile but durable thread that anyone can follow through the universe if they've already felt seen by something someone else has made, even if that person is just an earlier version of themselves. The one thing Rimbaud was doing in the late 70s through the 80s in the New York downtown scene was helping folks play. And sometimes I want to say, you play too much. It's not that j'ai un autre, I is another, or I is other. Maybe someone has ideas about the difference between another and other that I don't understand yet. But in order to be able to say as much, you are already standing outside yourself, taking up another position, one that is not yours. Something that is hard because it is scary, taking up a position that is not my own. We are so proprietary about our positions. And I cannot be other to myself unless I am not afraid of dying. How can I play again? Hannah Arendt says, we are born to begin. Here's another sentence I wrote. Wojnarowicz's Rimbaud engages the idea that we can know more than we know, which also invites the possibility that we may need to know much less than we think we do. I think this means if you're sure you can't survive, how do you do it anyway? People do it all the time, begin again. This is a translation of another beginning, revising what has already occurred without staying too close to the original. I don't have to go back without also going forward. It's like shuffle ball change if you've ever taken tap dancing classes. There's a marvelous emphasis on shifts in weight distribution. Here's my own rhythm of adolescence, and perhaps yours too. I'm sure adolescents are shifting their weight distribution all the time. That face that is both theirs and not theirs, here but not here, I'm already traversing the terrain of witnessing when I am sitting with this image of Rimbaud, its absence on the cover of Brian's book and its presence on the back of my pamphlet, and I am walking the perimeter of a scene of translation. How do we put into words an experience of reading and of living that is more than what we are able to know? I imagine Brian at the bar counting syllables, letting the noise of the room both touch him and add to the count somehow, but as a decibel, it figures somewhere in the atmosphere. I find it inspiring, imagining what we need to translate. What we need to translate: fantasy in reading, being close but not too close, and the subsequent living. Why subsequent? I don't know. I'll get back to you. If I let my mind wander, I hold the act of writing loosely, differently, openly. What have I let in and allowed to make contact without orchestrating it? One thing I've been thinking about in my training to become a psychoanalyst and psychotherapist is that interpretations don't create change. The ability to believe in a new interpretation suggests that change has already happened, but the change is not in the interpretation itself. I've had this idea about suicidal fantasy, and this comes from the work in part of David Wojnarowicz's series, where if you can see these strips, there's a suicidal fantasy, certainly central to Wojnarowicz's photographs of the Rimbaud figure. I've had this suicidal fantasy. Yes, I have. I've also had this idea about suicidal fantasy as a fantasy of surviving an unsurvivable life. What does that mean? To be able to generate the idea, I had to understand that I had already survived. What does that mean? Translate. Okay, someone had already killed a part of me, someone who should have loved me entirely. And I'd seen enough violence to suggest that another part of me could be next. What is this process? It's what it's like to work with material that has not yet been translated effectively enough to yield the change we might need. I stare through the eyes of the mask made by cigarettes, undoubtedly, eyes made by cigarette holes, a way of destroying in order to see, which is not something I celebrate. And I see just the paper of the box the mask comes in. My history with this object is that it's been saved and represents saving. Is this the first time it occurs to me that saving and safety have to be connected etymologically? It's obvious and it's stunning. Something is already different. I want to keep the safety on. The thin line between change and safety, perhaps that's what Wojnarowicz teeters on in his pre-AIDS series of photographs of someone, many different ones, wearing a mask of the famous photograph of Rimbaud. Here he is, whoever he is, all covered up and without changing expression. I find it depressing, but maybe it makes the person wearing it feel safe. I feel seen by it, seen by the hiding, one step closer to cosmic citizenry. I don't necessarily imagine Wojnarowicz knew Rimbaud thought poets must make seers of themselves, and more than that, cosmic citizens. I want to talk about that. Can we talk about cosmic citizenry in the Q&A? Is there a Q&A? There's not a Q&A. But maybe we could talk about it next time. I don't imagine Wojnarowicz knew he knew it, but there was something he didn't know that he worked with that would call out to us in the 21st century. Do you see what I see? Meaning, can you experience what I experience without being killed too? I can take off the mask. I'm not the same as him, and you're not the same as yourself, and we are alone, but I'm able to feel what this is like without making a claim that destroys the experience of difference that keeps us alive. Here's a sentence from Rimbaud. Let him die in his career through unprecedented and unnameable things. Other horrible workers will come. They will start from the horizons where the other collapsed. And this takes us full circle and back to Brian Kim Stefans. Thank you.
Wow, that was really great. Like I've taken so many notes, and I, just to figure out what I might do to either address, close off, be as great as things that other people have said. You might be hearing some oboe playing from upstairs. I'm at my brother-in-law's an oboist, and he's practicing something. There's so many things, and I'm just going to throw out a few loose things. And Anna, brought up that whole notion of the cosmic citizens, and then, that was probably I've been like I said, I've been reading Rimbaud since I was in high school, and I'm sure many of you have. But it's the more recent kind of reading of it that I was doing, of his work that I was doing when I was doing this book, was the notion that I think, he has been adopted as a kind of figure of the marginal, and he was just always marginal, and, he would never assimilate. But I think, it's just mentioning David Wojnarowicz, and Anna had mentioned that this was his that the mask work was the pre-AIDS work, which I'd be interested. It's too bad we don't have a Q&A, because I would like to ask what that means. But certainly during the AIDS crisis, Wojnarowicz became this, fantastic essayist. And, in my mind, that whole period was very transformative of, that's when kind of queer activism of a certain nature, emerged and so forth. And I think a similar thing happens with kind of Black nationalists. Nobody really talked about race too much in this talk, but Rimbaud was embraced by Aimé Césaire, for instance, of the negritude. And then I think someone like Amiri Baraka, and this kind of, this kind of transformation he was making in kind of Black American consciousness, which, obviously was informed by the negritude, goes back to Rimbaud on a certain level. So the key term is transformation, transformative consciousness. And it really goes against any kind of abstract or even public discourse, but it seems to be so kind of close to something that's actually happening. And, Rimbaud is probably in some ways the least abstract of all. Well, again, I say something like that as if I really know, but, he wasn't a terribly abstract poet. I mean, that's why he's fun to translate. But he had that whole French logicism and cynicism and irony, and then of course this mastery of form where he just wanted to show off and so forth, which I think makes him endlessly interesting. So anyway, I'm just going to read two more poems, and I'd love this notion of Rimbaud as kind of a trans writer, because he's invisible, and he really is invisible. And to be honest with you, I only asked that I requested that his face not be on the cover, not because I don't like his face, or because I just felt like the face was a little bit maybe overused, right? It seems like every book that comes out about Rimbaud will have this one famous photograph on the cover. But I think it created some. The cover design is really lovely. So I'm going to read one poem, which is the famous one that he wrote with Verlaine. And Verlaine is he's a tricky character himself. And so the quatrains are by Verlaine, and then Rimbaud writes the tercets, the two tercets at the end. And it's called Idle Sonnet to the Asshole. But it was actually, as I think runs throughout his work, he's actually often very critical of heteronormative aesthetics about women, And he was responding to this book in which this poet wrote about all these different body parts of this woman, idealizing it. And he was like, well, you know, whatever, let's, he seemed to have skipped this one part of the body. So it's called Idle Sonnet to the Asshole. In dark shadows, wrinkled like a creviced violet, it breathes contentedly, silly among the reeds, still moist with the love it most recently received, white buttocks coursing from their inclines to its edge. Filaments straggle like hot, wet weepings of milk, which the cruel wind banishes to a life of flight over small plots of marl that, reddish in their height, confuse and distract them. They fall like battered silk. So that's Verlaine's part. And Verlaine wrote a lot of erotic poems, very, you know, physical poems, both to men and women. So that's very Verlaine-esque in a way. And then Rimbaud's part is, in my dreams, my mouth was poised above its abyss, my soul envious of physical coitus, usurped it for sobs, a bottle for tear tincture. An aromatic olive or seductive flute, shoot down which currents of heavenly praline shoot, a feminine canon bedewed by sharp moisture. So that's that poem. And then just as a final poem, quickly, because, so there was this whole period, I would read The Blacksmith, which is probably his most Marxist poem. It's his kind of reimagining of a scene from the French Revolution. And I actually published my version of it on Facebook when I used to kind of put my drafts on Facebook. I actually did posted it on Marx's birthday, and I didn't do that on purpose, but that was the case. But I kind of like my translation of a poem of his called The Dance of the Hanged Men, which it's just imagery of Paris. I don't think he was in Paris during the Commune. I'm quite sure he wasn't. I think Kristen Ross also agrees. I mean, that's where I get my information from. But nonetheless, he was clearly thinking about it, and he was thinking about death and chaos and things that were happening. But also, he's very not fatalistic, but he certainly didn't believe in the afterlife. And this is called Dance of the Hanged Men. Cheerful, so it's kind of an image. It's a bit of a medieval image. He was conjuring a lot of kind of medieval ideas. Dance of the Hanged Men. Cheerful black one-armed gallows. There dance the heroes. The devil's skinny paladins, like the skeletons of Saladins. Monsieur Beelzebub dangles by their neckties his little black puppets. They grimace at the sky. He smacks their dark brows with his meaty hands' backsides, sets them dancing to the sounds of Noels. And the puppets' arms, like hollow black organ pipes, entangle as they jostle. They group, get enmeshed, a hideous lovemaking. Day shines through their breasts, on which, in rosier times, beldams press their heads. So it's very subversive. He's looking at these skeletons and saying, look at those guys. You know, those guys were like those were the heroes. Now look at them. Ha, you gay dancers, divested of your flab. These stages are so wide. You've room. Experiment. Hop. No need to ask if it's warfare or a dance. Beelzebub, enraged, inspired, shreds his violin. Oh, the hard heels. Who needs a shoe or a sandal? Now almost all remove their skin button-downs. What's left is not too shabby, hardly a scandal. On their skulls, the snow sets down a white sombrero. A crow rests like a plume on these jigsaw cracked heads. A little piece of flesh dangles from their thin chins. One could say, as they mingle in their dark contests, that they're stiff knights clashing, wearing armor of tin. Ha! The breeze whistles through this grand Stellian ball. The black gibbet groans like an organ of iron. On the horizon, the sky is the red of hell. The wolves howl accompaniment from their violet wolves. Hey, someone shake up those funereal sluggards who, with their fat broken fingers, arrogantly spread their rosaries across their white vertebrae. You, the passed away. This ain't no monastery. Oh, there in the middle of this dance macabre, A grand maddened skeleton springs to the red sky, a bit too zealous, like an Arabian horse, and still feeling the rope saddled around his spine, clenches his small fingers around his thigh. It cracks with cries similar to jeers, but like a clown who retires to his room but then suddenly leaps back, he rejoins the dance to the singing of the bones. Cheerful, black, one-armed gallows, their dance dance the heroes, the devil's skinny paladins, like the skeletons of Saladins. So it's not one of his most famous poems, and it's not one that I remember when I was reading him in high school, but I enjoyed translating it, and I think it does have something to do with like his imagination of what was happening, during the Paris Commune. Anyway, so let me just thank you so much, and thank everybody involved, and thank you all who are here on YouTube if you're still here. I'll hand this back to Zoe, if that's what I'm supposed to do. But thank you so much, and yeah, buy the book if you get a chance.
Yeah, thank you all for coming tonight. This officially concludes our program. As Brian said, please seek out the book, and please also, there's a great season of small press traffic readings ahead, I'm sure. And also, the only thing I have left to say is that was lovely, and I would also encourage you to check out the individual writings, not necessarily about Rimbaud, but maybe by all the other readers and presenters tonight. So thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure.